Welcome everyone to Bringing the Collective Together, Non-Human Animals, Humans, and Practice at the University. I'm Laura Janara from the Political Science Department at UBC. Thank you, Green College, for supporting and hosting this interdisciplinary enterprise. None of us is expert in everything that is at stake around our theme. We really need each other to confront it. Also, please consider that we are on the unceded land of the Musqueam, a nation with a rich conception of right social relations between humans and animals. As part of our series, acclaimed author Frans de Waal will speak tomorrow in the Freddie Wood Theatre from 3 o'clock to 5 o'clock, so please come. He has studied conflict resolution and empathy amongst non-human primates, macaques, chimps, and others. His research works in part as a corrective to human violence and failure to practice empathy. I'd like to give warmest thanks to Anne Cameron of Psychology and Max Cameron of Political Science for bringing Frans de Waal to campus to us. So our focus this evening is the governance of non-human animals in a democratic society, and I'm going to introduce this topic in my capacity as a political philosopher. Today, we take democracy as an obvious good, but democracy doesn't necessarily bring safety or the good life for everyone in the community. Democratic societies have practiced slavery, built internment camps, and otherwise subjugate community members who are deemed other. For democracy to be good for everyone, the life ends of all community members must be included in the public good. And failure anywhere is dangerous for everyone. Colonialism, discrimination against the disabled, sexism, racism, and modern thinking about animals, these are not discrete historical phenomena, scholars show us. Objectification, instrumentalization, commodification, property relations and ownership marginalize humans and animals alike. Leading scholars are thus analyzing human-animal relations as political. And I will introduce today to you two recent scholarly arguments that follow the logic of democracy and justice and thereby conceptualize animals as citizens. First, Will Kymlicka and Sue Donaldson. Will Kymlicka is a world-renowned liberal political philosopher of citizenship. He's not a radical, he's in the liberal mainstream. His and Donaldson's starting point is to debunk a powerful ideology, the ideology that there's nature on one side and human society on the other. The empirical reality is that the existing community is a mixed interspecies community. In response to this obvious empirical fact that we nonetheless tend to deny, Kymlicka and Donaldson lay out a political theory that attends to wild animals, to liminal animals who live amongst humans, animals like raccoons and rats and peregrine falcons, and domesticated animals. And I will focus today on their argument about domesticated animals, our fellow community members. Combined with the principles of democracy, liberalism requires that community co-members be co-citizens so that they may together articulate what is just. And what is the alternative? Humans may live unjustly with their fellow community members, but living unjustly diminishes human flourishing. So liberal democracy grants two main kinds of rights: inviolable rights for the individual and citizenship rights. Inviolable rights for the individual are based largely on the ethics that we get from Immanuel Kant. He argues that the individual's basic interests must not be sacrificed for the perceived greater good of others. Each life is not a means, but an end in itself. Historically, Kant's ethics have won as our leading framework, but these ethics have not been applied fairly in history. The colonized, females, sexual minorities, racial minorities, and others have been struggling politically to win the rights that the powerful awarded themselves. We remain inside this ongoing historical process of struggle. Oh. And the next one. Thank you. These boys are from the Ivory Coast. They are enslaved child labor that makes sure that rich people in the world get chocolate. Our unfolding history demands that we ask, on what exact grounds can we grant Homo sapiens, but not other animals, basic inviolable rights? The criteria used to single out humans, capacity for language, for reason, for culture, and so forth, are actually highly problematic. They exclude many humans from humanity, and some other animals have these capacities. The reality is, individual Homo sapiens and individual other animals alike have distinctive subjective experiences of their own lives and of the world. Being sentient means your flourishing matters to you. If you are a macaque monkey, you experience your life as mattering to you. Accordingly, in recent legal judgments, animal sentience and vulnerability have been cited as legally relevant considerations. Generally, though, we still apply Kantian ethics in a manner that is philosophically and morally inconsistent. But even if you insist upon being thus inconsistent, Kimlicka and Donaldson argue, even if you reject basic rights for animals, you can still accept that liberalism requires citizenship rights for animals as the means to make the community just. Citizenship rights do three main things. First, they grant a right to belong to one's territorial community. Second, they grant a right to have one's interests included in determinations of the public good. Third, in democracy, they grant a right to participate in the political process. Now, it's obviously possible to give animals, first, a right to belong to their territorial communities, and second, a right to have their interests included in determinations of the public good. Granting these first two citizenship rights would change a lot about how humans and animals live together. And what about that third facet of citizenship, the right of participation, or what we can call political agency? What is political agency? Well, Kimlicka and Donaldson argue that it is seriously wrong to view it as a threshold capacity that determines who gets to be a citizen. If we conceptualize political agency as a threshold, we exclude many humans from citizenship. People with intellectual disabilities, with dementia and other illnesses, and children. Rather, embracing democracy means that we are obligated to enable the political participation of all members of the community. That's what it means to be democratic. We commit to treating fellow members according to the democratic values of agency, consent, and self-determination. Now, disability scholars and activists have made an enormous contribution here. Justice in a democracy, they say, requires that we enable everyone's political participation. People with mental disabilities can enact political agency when supported by collaborators who attend to their expressions of the good life. These expressions may be embodied rather than packaged as verbal speech. These expressions of dependent agency must then be brought into the political process. In this way, people with mental disabilities can help shape ongoing debates about justice. Kimlicka and Donaldson point out, though, that this is not about exceptional cases. What the disability movement has taught us is that all humans experience passages in life when our agency must be facilitated by others. In fact, we are all always dependent on structures for participation. So political agency is something we create through relationships and structures. So it turns out democratic citizenship is open to animals. Kimlicka and Donaldson write, we can elicit a range of expressions of preference to construct scripts of domesticated animals' interests and can bring those into the political process to help determine ongoing fair terms of interaction, justice. In 19th century America and Europe, people with disabilities were increasingly confined. This changed the public sphere. These now hidden lives could not act as a corrective presence that helped shape political consciousness. Unsurprisingly, this is when the eugenics movement hit its height. Although millions of animals live and die in our mixed human-animal community, most are confined in zones of invisibility, stockyards, slaughterhouses, labs, and elsewhere. This spatial ordering shapes what people know about animals in the community, and it invites their exclusion from considerations of justice. But if animals' needs and deprivations were visible in the public sphere, the animals themselves would catalyze political deliberation. They would challenge prevailing discourses, for example, that regulation ensures that they do not suffer. That is political agency. There was a scientist who was spending time with a community of macaques and had a camera, was taking a lot of photos, and then he abandoned the camera, and the macaques picked it up and started taking hundreds of photos, and this is a self-portrait that a macaque took. This is an act of agency. So citizenship has three main functions. All are applicable to animals in the name of justice. This does not necessarily ban all relations of use amongst humans in the community or between humans and animals in the community. But democracy means that we ask, does a social practice condemn any community member to permanent subordination to others? The answer has to be no. Does a social practice undermine the realization by community members of their own life projects? The answer has to be no. Domesticated animals are very vulnerable to exploitation. Human desire to derive for themselves forms of gain is very, very strong. Consider our community members, the macaque monkeys at UBC. Some community members agreed to confine and disable them here to study them. This situation is not clearly governed by liberal justice and democracy, but by other supposedly highly examined means. Yet these seem flawed, given the wholly desperate circumstances that arose for not one, but four of this small group of monkeys. What does such social practice do to democracy and justice for everyone? I'll now briefly turn to Bruno Latour, who is a world-renowned scholar of science studies. Latour also challenges the imagined divide between nature on one hand and human society on the other, and the companion division between science and democracy. This division is illicit, he says, problematic on both sides. Science gets to proceed as though scientific knowledge paradigms are power-free and foreclose no important knowledge. And political institutions can sidestep matters of necessity, such as global warming, focusing only on human preferences, while politicians do things like muzzle scientists. This historical division between science and democracy is based on the mistaken view, he argues, that representation happens in politics alone. In fact, Latour points out, politics and science both represent constituents to make them speak. So how does this work? First, in politics. Modern mass democracy does not work because citizens speak. They mostly don't speak. Modern democratic politics is based on staging. Electoral apparati are designed to stage constituencies and authorize representatives. The people are hereby made, and they are made to speak. See, political agency is structurally assisted. The constituency, the public, they're not already there and then just transparently reported. They are facts of art. To say France has decided, Latour observes, that is enigmatic. Science also represents, and it does so by staging, the facts of the non-human world, particles, fossils, mice. They do not speak on their own to scientists, but neither are scientists speaking about mute things. When scientists wonder about non-humans, they invent speech prostheses that allow non-humans to participate in human discussion. The scientist designs an experimental apparatus to stage a phenomenon, a non-human animal, for example. The devices, the techniques used, transform this phenomenon into a reliable witness who says something to the scientist. This staging hereby elicits speech that scientists can understand and talk about. So note, the practice of representing non-humans to make them speak to humans already exists. Latour says we can integrate this practice into political institutions, and we must, because the existing separation of democracy and science dangerously separates out questions of justice and power from questions of necessity and fact. Housed under science, non-humans are outside of justice. And humans are ruled by preference and self-interest, not by necessities such as global warming. Latour says, collect everyone under one single assembly. Here, all members can speak to each other. Everyone should be present together in the public sphere. In this singular assembly, all acts of representation would be subject to doubt and scrutiny, and representation would be pluralized. So, for example, some scientists may stage those salmon and offer a proposition about them. Musqueam may contest or further articulate that proposition based on different knowledge and ways of representing. Stephen Harper may make another proposition about those salmon. Critical public deliberation about necessity, power, and justice would then ensue. How we live together in our shared community makes us. Martin Luther King said, "We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly." So let us bring the collective together. I now introduce our moderator for this evening, Nina von Kaiserlink, who is a professor in UBC's Animal Welfare Program. Nina works to increase the health and welfare of animals in society, particularly of dairy cows and calves. And Nina is also the current chair of the Board of Governors of the Canadian Council on Animal Care.
Thank you, Laura. It really, really, truly is a pleasure to be able to moderate tonight's session. It's something that's dear to my heart, and I look at all of David's and my David Fraser, who moderated the first session, and my other colleague, Dan Weary, who moderated the second session, who is unable to attend tonight. The three of us, we see our fleet of students here, and we're incredibly proud of them because we, around our lunch table, have many, many discussions, not quite the same language as what you used here, but pertaining to the governance of animals. I would also like to acknowledge Laura's students, and if I can ask those that, her undergraduate students who really are leading this charge, that created the opportunity for us, for the collective to come together. Can you put your hands up? There's some of you in this room. A few of you. It's also been a great pleasure because we in the Animal Welfare Program, we're on totally the other side of campus. And political science is on this side of campus. These are two worlds that never would have come together under normal circumstances. And one of Laura's students now is doing an undergraduate thesis with my colleague Dan. And to me, that's some of the richness that comes out of bringing the collective together. So tonight we have three panelists who, thank you for agreeing to talk. I guess that would be a good thing. I'm going to introduce them, and what I'm going to ask is that we hold the questions until after Michael, who's the last speaker, speaks. Each of them will speak for about 15 minutes, and then we'll roll into the next one, followed by the third. And then we'll have hopefully about an hour for some active discussion. I am the moderator. I will moderate. I mean, part of this, the goal here is to have active scholarly discourse. So on that note, I would like to introduce the first speaker. Amber Prince has a bachelor degree in criminology from SFU. She obviously fell in love with law at that time. She came then to UBC and did a degree in law here. And then she went, while she was here, I just found out, she took one of our courses on the ethics, animal welfare and the ethics of animal use. And at that time, because I remember this, we had I think it's Dr. Vaughn Black from the University of Dalhousie Law School, who gave a one-time course in animal law, which Amber took, and I guess that's where the love and passion for looking at sort of the legal aspects of animals in the law. This then became the focus of her master's thesis on animal cruelty legislation in Canada, which she did at the University of Victoria. Amber is Cree and of European heritage and a member of the Sucker Creek First Nation in Alberta. So Amber, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Nina. And thanks to Green College for inviting me, and Laura Janara in particular, who is a fabulous organizer, which I appreciate in a person because that's not my specialty. I would also like to personally acknowledge and thank the Musqueam in particular and the Coast Salish peoples in general, on whose traditional and unceded territory we occupy today. And the focus of my talk will be around the question that was posed to me by Laura and the Green College. And that question is, how might humans attend to the needs and standpoints of non-human animals? And I'm going to do my best to try and answer that question in 3 parts. And just so you folks know where I'm going with that, I'll tell you what those 3 parts are. First, I'd like to take stock of where we're at currently with respect to our treatment of animals in Canada. Obviously, given my background, I'm going to focus on our legal treatment of animals. And I'm going to give some suggestions on how we can legally better meet the needs and standpoints of animals. And this is going to segue into a bit of a critique of our current legal uses of animals, particularly for me, our uses of animals as food and research models. So, taking stock of where we are legally with respect to animals. I have had some time to think about this. As Nina mentioned, I first became interested in this topic when I was able to take a one-time only ever offered course at the UBC Law School on animals and the law. And unfortunately, I think that's where I learned that the things that you fear are happening to animals are happening to them, and that those things are perfectly legal for the majority of animals in this country also, unfortunately. So just starting with farming as an example, approximately 600 to 700 million animals are slaughtered in Canada every year for human consumption. And many of those animals are hot iron branded, dehorned, castrated, tail docked, debeaked, and all without anesthetics. These are practices which, I mean, common sense tells you are going to be painful, but veterinarians also, fully acknowledge that these are painful practices. And these practices are permitted by the Canadian Agri-Food Research Council. They are the body that provides standard practices for livestock animals. And while there are some abuses within these codes that do discourage certain practices, such as using an electric cattle prod on an animal's face or genitals, these codes of practices are voluntary at this point. So, animals reared for human consumption in Canada are generally raised in warehouse-type barns outside of the public eye, and I guess that's why it took me until second year of law school to really know what was going on with animals in our country. And animals are often confined in spaces so small that they can't move a step or even turn around. And as the codes are voluntary, we can assume that animals are even kept in even smaller and more terrible conditions than that. So I think it's fair to say that animals are born and raised in significant suffering, pain, and stress well before they're even begin their stressful transport to slaughter and death. So that's the vast majority of animals in Canada. Then another significant portion of animals in Canada are involved in research. So I just looked this up today, and I think the last time I looked this up, it was somewhere in the neighborhood of 2.5 million animals used in research, and now it's about 3.5, I think. 2010 was the last figure I was able to find. And those experiments in Canada also allow animals to be subjected to considerable pain and obviously death as well. What I've come to learn since, that second year course in law school and doing my master's in law is that animals can become what are called purpose-bred models that can be ordered by catalog number with any disease or ailment imaginable, such as AIDS, cancer, heart disease. Bone cancer always sticks out for me as a particularly difficult thing to impose on an animal. Pigs are periodically harvested for their organs, and monkeys and cells can be induced with Parkinson's disease for study. Animals who survive these experiments can be used again and again until they're basically not able to be used again. And obviously the end result there is death. So these experiments are acknowledged and permitted despite the pain and death that is caused. Some experiments might include, well, they do include, extremely painful experiments. And I'm taking some excerpts here from the Canadian Council on Animal Care, who sets out also some guidelines around what levels of invasive experiments can be conducted on animals in Canada. So I'm going to quote from category D, which is considered the second most painful experiments that are permitted. And it's an excerpt, so it's not everything. I kind of picked out the things that stood out for me. So quoting here, prolonged, several hours or more periods of physical restraint, induction of behavioral stresses, such as maternal deprivation, aggression, procedures which cause severe, persistent, or irreversible disruption of sensio-motor disorganization, the exposure of an animal to noxious stimuli from which escape is impossible. And then the most invasive category of experiments that are conducted are called category E experiments, which are also permitted in Canada. And I'll quote again from an excerpt from that section. So, quote, exposure to noxious stimuli, drugs or chemicals at levels which cause death, severe pain, or extreme distress, burn or trauma infliction on unanesthetized animals. So in 2010, over 1 million animals in Canada were subjected to category D and category E experiments. Mostly in category D, but there was a good portion as well in category E. So I think what really stood out for me learning about a lot of this stuff in second year law school was Canadian law actually concerns itself with a very small minority of animals, companion animals, the ones that we see every day instead of the ones that are locked out of our sight. And companion animals make up 1% of animals in Canada. And even with the laws we do have that protects those animals, they are so weak that presently 1/4% of animal cruelty investigations end in convictions. So, not protecting a lot of animals there. And this is why I really felt compelled to pursue this further in my graduate studies. And I think it really begs the question. I mean, Canada prides itself on being a progressive, democratic, civilized society. And there is a quote by Gandhi that some of you may know, which is that the greatness of a nation and its moral progress can be judged by the way its animals are treated. And I think, based on what I've just told you, and based on what I've come to know, I think you have to ask yourself how we measure up in terms of greatness as a nation and moral progress. So that's just the taking stock piece. And I think I may rephrase Laura's question to be, how do we better attend to the needs and standpoints of non-human animals? Because I think from my perspective, we're not doing very well. And there's lots of room for improvement that, in my view, is absolutely practical, feasible, and ethically imperative for one of the world's most wealthiest countries. And I think even if Canada took a very conservative and narrow approach to improving the lives of animals, there's much that could be done very easily. There are countries, European countries, and New Zealand, who have taken some steps that I think we could easily incorporate. Some of those countries have banned veal crates, battery cages, sow stalls. We live in a big, spacious country, and companies who rear animals for food and research make a lot of money. I looked this up yesterday just to refresh myself, and there's millions and billions of dollars being put into those industries. And I think it's also really important that the standards that we have to attempt to protect animals can't be voluntary. Now, I should note there are some initiatives in Canada right now to try and amend some of our codes of practices, and I know the Canadian Federation of Humane Societies is trying to make those more enforceable and make companies accountable to those, but at this time they're not. And in other countries, these things are legislated, so they're actually sanctioned by law. And I just think, you know, coming from a legal perspective, thinking about voluntary standards for this stuff, it's like saying that we would just make murder and robbery and assaults come under a voluntary code of practice that we can, you know, hopefully we will follow, but nothing really there to say that we must. And legislation in other countries also goes beyond minimum needs of food and water to some more thoughtfulness around emotional and species-specific needs of animals, such as the need for companionship, the need to roam and graze and play and those type of things. I'm sure the Animal Welfare Program is looking at some of those things too and advocating for those. Several European countries have also followed New Zealand's lead in taking the stance that great apes are so similar to humans that using them is unethical in animal research. So in New Zealand and some of these other countries that are now getting on board, this research, testing and teaching with great apes is illegal. So these are just a few examples of, I think, what could be considered pretty conservative, modest improvements that we could make to better protect food and research animals, the majority of animals in this country. However, as my last piece, I want to just problematize these practices a little bit because in my view, the use of animals in these industries is morally suspect, really. Just starting with food animals, for example, I mean, eating animals in Canada today is generally unnecessary. Most Canadians have the ability to be vegetarian, to even be vegan, and most medical professionals will tell you that actually being vegetarian is healthier for you. Some of those benefits include reducing risk of heart disease, obesity, blood pressure, type 2 diabetes, osteoporosis, and some cancers. So rather than testing on animals to prevent some of these diseases, we could actually do some of that ourselves. Now, there may be rare cases where animal life is actually threatened by the inability to consume animals. As someone of Aboriginal heritage, I'm mindful of the fact that there are Aboriginal peoples in this country that actually do subsisting hunting and fishing. But unfortunately, what I found in my graduate work is that there are a lot of people that like to expropriate, a lot of animal industry users that like to expropriate that argument for their own use, which I think is wrong. And I think that they are attempting to exaggerate a need which is actually really a preference for most people. So with respect to experimenting on animals, I had a chance to watch one of the last videos from one of the talks that was here before, and I think there was a great point made by a member of the audience, which I share the point that I think there's irony that animal researchers on one hand argue that animals are similar enough to humans that we can extrapolate that information as being applicable to humans. But on the other hand, if animals are so similar to us, what moral ground do we have to actually be using them then? If it's not okay to test on humans, then why is it okay to test on animals? And for me, I have to question the applicability of data derived from animal research. In the words of one American scientist, Dr. Elisabeth Whalen, I'm quoting from her, "It doesn't take a PhD in the sciences to grasp the fact that rodent exposure to the saccharine equivalent of 1,800 bottles of soda a day doesn't relate well to our daily ingestion of a few glasses a day of the stuff." And it was pointed out also by a fairly well-known American lawyer working in this area, Gary Francione, that the drug thalidomide was tested on animals, for example, before that was given to people, and yet that caused serious and unexpected harms for humans. So, wrapping up, I think as a supposedly progressive, democratic, wealthy nation, we should be working to, at minimum, match the initiatives that are happening in Europe and New Zealand. We should be among the progressive countries, not the ones that are lagging behind. There's no reason also why we couldn't actually lead the way in exceeding those standards, and I think, actually critically questioning our current uses and treatment of animals in Canada. And I think, I really appreciate being given the opportunity for us to have that discussion today. And I just want to close with what I think is a great quote on this topic, and this is a quote by anthropologist Barbara Smuts. And she says, "When a human being relates to an individual non-human being as an anonymous object, rather than a being with its own subjectivity, it is the human and not the other animal who relinquishes personhood." So on that note, thank you very much. I appreciate your time.
So it's with great pleasure that I'm able to introduce the next speaker. Again, it's always a pleasure as a faculty member when you see your students begin to fly. And Elisabeth is one of our students, and she's really starting to fly. Elisabeth came to us from Edinburgh. She'd completed an undergraduate in neuroscience at the Edinburgh Medical School and a master's degree in applied animal behavior and welfare. Her research interests brought her to Canada, where she is now in her final year of her PhD in the animal welfare program. Elisabeth spent the last 2 years working in Ottawa, actually, as a research fellow with the Canadian Council on Animal Care. We've been also very, very fortunate to have Elisabeth decide to continue to working with us after she finishes her PhD. She's been awarded one of the most prestigious SSHRC federal postgraduate scholarships, which will allow her to continue working in her chosen area. And I'm going to let her tell you about what she's been up to, and she's going to talk to you a little bit about the ethical oversight systems around the world.
And before I start, I'd also like to thank Laura and her absolutely dedicated team of students for pulling this together, and also for inviting me to be a part of it. It's an absolute pleasure. So this evening I've been charged with the task of providing an overview of different international governance structures overseeing the use of animals in research. And I'll do this by focusing on 3 countries that publish the most animal-based research. So my original homeland, the United Kingdom, the United States, and my chosen homeland, Canada. Where relevant, I'll tip a hat to other countries that have systems with important elements that we can perhaps learn from. But I'm going to focus on 4 different components of the existing regulatory systems governing research animal use. First of all, I'll talk about the type of governance itself, whether that's through legislation or through other regulatory processes. Then I'll talk about the ethical review of animal-based research. I'll go on to talk about inspections or assessment of animal facilities and animal care and use programs, and I'll finish up with the publication of annual animal statistics. And it's worth noting that I didn't simply pick these 4 things arbitrarily. My own research involving close to 1,300 participants, including members of the public, identified these 4 things as the most valued components of governance systems. So when thinking about different types of governance, it's quite serendipitous that the UK, the US, and Canada provide a continuum from complete legislation to partial legislation to no legislation overseeing research animal use. Starting with the UK, there is national legislation specifically governing the use of animals in scientific procedures, and it's intuitively called the Animal Scientific Procedures Act, or ASPA. And it enforces a 3-tier licensing system. At the top level, principal investigators are required to hold a project license, which covers the entire program of work being covered. So that will include a suite of protocols over a number of years. At the next level, all staff that are going to be working directly with animals as part of the project must hold a personal license, and I myself have been a personal license holder in the UK. There is also a requirement under ASPA to hold a certificate of designation which indicates the location and facility where the proposed animal research will take place. And it's my understanding that under this certification, researchers are prohibited from carrying out their proposed research at any other location. It's also worth noting that since the UK is part of the European Union, it's also bound by an EU directive that is specific to research animal use. And this directive is transposed into UK law via the Animal Scientific Procedures Act. So if we leave Europe and travel across the Atlantic to the US, we'll find a partially legislated system. So the United States has a Federal Animal Welfare Act that is enforced by the United States Department of Agriculture. And this act is intended to provide minimum standards of care for research animals. However, under this act, the definition of animal currently excludes mice, rats, birds, fish, and reptiles, species that collectively represent roughly 95% of all animals used in scientific research in the US. That being said, there are other non-legislative components that complement the Animal Welfare Act. The National Institutes of Health, a major granting agency, and its Office for Laboratory Animal Welfare provide guidance and interpretation of the Public Health Service policy on the humane care and use of laboratory animals. This PHS policy covers all vertebrate animals used in research. And in addition, the Institute for Laboratory Animal Research, ILAR, also publishes guides to the care and use of laboratory animals for US. So if we move north, up into Canada, there is no national legislation specifically governing the use of animals in research. There is, however, a quasi-regulatory body called the Canadian Council on Animal Care, for whom I was a research fellow. The CCAC is funded to operate by major granting bodies that provide funds that support animal-based research. Any establishment funded by these major granting agencies is obligated to comply with CCAC guidelines. It is not voluntary. The premise is that any institution found to be in non-compliance will have its funding withdrawn. Any establishments not funded by the major granting agencies are not obligated to be part of the CCAC program, but they can volunteer to do so, and it is my understanding that many do. So that gives you a bit of a snapshot of different types of governance systems that are international. And one of the major components of the governance structure is the ethical review of animal research. An ethical review system is where research protocols proposing the use of live animals, including pilot studies, are reviewed for their scientific and ethical merit and their adherence to three principles called the 3 Rs. The 3 Rs are the tenets of humane animal experimentation. The first is replacement, so you must replace animals with a non-animal alternative wherever possible. You must reduce the number of animals wherever possible. And you must refine either procedures or techniques or the general care and handling so that pain and distress are minimized and where possible animal welfare is enhanced. So to recap, an ethical review includes the review of protocols for their scientific and ethical merit and adherence to these 3 Rs, and then a decision is made about whether the research is allowed to proceed. In Canada and the US, this responsibility lies with animal care committees and institutional animal care and use committees, respectively. In the UK, the ethical review system is slightly different in that it provides a local framework for implementation of the 3 Rs and improving animal welfare, but it's my understanding that the decision about whether certain protocols should be allowed to proceed happen at the Home Office level with the issuing of a project license. On an interesting note, Sweden have a slightly different approach for their ethical review. So animal protocols before being approved are published publicly for a set period of time and are open to comment from anyone, experts and lay people alike. In addition, the committees that do that ethical review in Sweden are arm's length rather than being affiliated with a particular institution. So the Swedish system offers a third-party ethical review. So once research has been ethically reviewed and allowed to proceed, it's hoped that any research underway will be either assessed or inspected in some manner. And the UK, the US, and Canada have distinct ways of inspecting and assessing animal research facilities and programs of work. In the UK, inspections are carried out by the Home Office. And at the last count, there were 29 Home Office inspectors covering 230 establishments, which are visited on average 11 to 12 times per year. It's also worth noting that these visits are random and routine. However, my understanding is that this may be set to change due to the current economic constraints in Europe. Here in Canada, assessments of animal care and use programs are carried out by CCAC assessment panels. And these panels are made up of CCAC assessment directors and animal care committees, of which one individual must be a community representative. There are only 4 CCAC assessment directors, so these panel visits typically occur every 3 years. However, there are local level assessments carried out by the animal care committees, which typically happen at least once a year. And there are also veterinary visits, which I understand happen more frequently. In addition, Canada now has a system of post-approval monitoring, where after a study is underway, principal investigators will be randomly selected for audit. Protocols are typically assigned to a category of invasiveness. We've already heard a little bit about those, and that gives the best estimate of the anticipated harms that will be experienced by the animals in a given experiment. Categories run from A to E, with E being the most severe. For categories D and E, the random post-approval audits can be no more than once every year, and for categories B and C, they are no more than once every 3 years. In the US, facility visits and accreditations are carried out by the Association for Assessment and Accreditation of Laboratory Animal Care, or ALAC. ALAC is a non-profit organisation whose mission is to promote humane treatment of animals in science through confidential, voluntary accreditation of animal care and use programs, so institutions volunteer to be part of the ALAC accreditation program. So I'll finish with the publication of annual animal statistics. Canada, whose animal numbers in research, teaching and testing for 2010 were roughly 3.3 million, and the UK, whose animal numbers in scientific procedures for 2010 were roughly 3.5 million, both publish publicly available annual animal statistics describing the numbers and species of animals used for various research purposes. I've already touched on the Canadian categories of invasiveness. The UK also has a system for classifying harms to animals in research, but they use 3 levels. They use mild, moderate, and substantial. And one important distinction between Canada and the UK is that the UK does not actually report out their animal numbers broken down by severity category. However, again, I believe this is set to change with the implementation of the new EU directive. On an interesting note regarding how harms to animals in research are classified, I'd like to briefly mention the New Zealand system, which, rather than using terms like categories of invasiveness or severity, they use the term domains of welfare compromise. And it may sound like a simple semantic difference, but I think that shift in considering an animal's welfare status, rather than focusing on the procedure, is hugely important. One important thing to note about the annual animal statistics for the UK and Canada is that those numbers only represent the animals used in experiments of one kind or another. They do not include animals kept in laboratories for breeding purposes. So in the US, things are a little more difficult when it comes to the animal numbers. Animal numbers are clearly published for the United States Department of Agriculture for all animals that fall under the Animal Welfare Act. For 2010, this total was roughly 1.1 million animals. But remember that mice, rats, birds, fish, and reptiles are excluded from those numbers. Precise figures for those species in the US do not exist, but a recently published estimate put the figure for 2010 at roughly 25 million. So it's clear from the animal numbers that I just cited for the 3 countries under discussion that there are millions of animal lives affected by the policy decisions that we make. And in my personal opinion, it is hugely important to keep the animals central to our decision making, and even more importantly, to count every animal as well as making every animal count. In closing, I would like to reiterate my thanks to Green College and to Laura Janara, and actually to you all for being here, because I think we're in for some good discussion. Thank you.
Our last speaker is Dr. Michael McDonald, who after 41-year career at the University of British Columbia and the University of Waterloo, is a professor emeritus of the Applied Ethics program in the Professor Emeritus of Applied Ethics in the W. Maurice Young Center for Applied Ethics. Michael served as the center's founding director and occupied the first chair of Applied Ethics in the center. His teaching and research has covered a wide range of areas at the intersection of ethical theory and practice. These include minority rights, Aboriginal rights, business ethics, professional ethics, accounting ethics, and bioethics. Over the past several years, Michael's main research has been in the research ethics, focusing on the governance of research involving humans. In this area, he authored a major report for the then Law Commission of Canada and multiple articles and reports in bioethics and law journals, as well as being extensively involved in the formation of national policy. His research has been sponsored by CIHR, SSHRC, and the Canadian STEM Network, and a variety of public, not-for-profit, and private organizations. Michael was a member of the UBC's Animal Care Committee in the early 1990s. He later represented the Canadian Bioethics Society on the board of the Canadian Council on Animal Care. Michael was a member of the expert panel created by the Royal Society of Canada to advise Health Canada on the disposition of the primate colony in Ottawa. As director of the Centre of Applied Ethics, Michael partnered with the then Faculty of Agriculture, now Land and Food System, my home faculty, to create the UBC Animal Welfare Program. Thank you, Michael. He has since then been involved in teaching and research with that program, serving as a mentor for several graduate students. The floor is yours, Michael.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all who came here. That we're having this discussion in the congenial forum of Green College is a positive step forward. It cannot but help to break down the sense of isolation between apparent insiders and outsiders. Both may feel quite beleaguered. Research scientists, particularly those who serve on animal care committees and the CCAC, may feel their work is unappreciated and potentially in peril. Critics of animal welfare may feel there is a code of silence protecting practices that are ethically unacceptable. Alienation grows. While this sort of alienation is all too common in our public institutions, witness here the tight control on information maintained by our federal government, I see it as a positive step forward that in this university, at this very time, we have come together to exchange ideas and engage in dialogue over these issues. It would be very sad indeed if we were unable to do this in an institution of higher learning committed to the pursuit of knowledge in a rigorous and respectful manner. So I'd like to thank Laura and her students and all those who have come here to participate in this discussion. I'm going to take a different approach than the other speakers to the topic for this forum, which is the governance of non-human animals at the university in a democratic society. I will offer some comparisons between research involving animals and research involving humans, and then speak about the governance of those two areas. As indicated in the introduction, I've been involved in a number of ways directly with the ethical treatment of animals, including the ways mentioned. I do have to say that for the panel that I was on for the disposition of Health Canada's primate colony, that was triggered by a photo of the Ottawa Citizen. At that point, the Minister of Health, this was a very well-kept sort of thing, they were going to simply dispose of the colony by euthanizing all the macaque monkeys that were there. One of the lab technicians, one suspects, simply put a photo in which appeared on the front page of the Ottawa Citizen of 3 macaques. And young macaques, when they're together, they hold each other. And if you can't be melted by the view of 3 macaques hugging each other, these little babies and stuff, you won't be melted by anything. At that point, the Minister of Health had to stand up in the afternoon and face questioning from across the Commons. The advice of the Royal Society was immediately sought on the thing, so photos have a lot of power. However, my main approach to the topic is through the work that I've done on Canadian governance of research involving humans. So that's the way I'm going to look at it, through a different lens than the other speakers. The protection of humans in research has many commonalities with the protection of animals. Both involve the pursuit of a social good, the acquisition of knowledge, and the other goods that come with research. This is done at the expense and risk of the research participants. This raises a fundamental question for us about the sacrifices we can ask of research participants for the benefits of others. How do we justify this? In many cases, humans make a free and informed choice to participate in research. However, it is important to note the numerous instances of research involving humans in which participation has been involuntary, in whole or in part. These include experimentation, including captive or confined populations. One thinks of the research that was done by the Nazi physicians, Japanese similarly in the Second World War, but also in post-war period, captive populations within U.S. institutions and Canadian institutions were used for research purposes against their own will and the will of those who had care of them. Experiments were done involving comatose patients. Research was done in which deceit was used to secure participation. And even setting aside these clear violations of human rights and dignity, there's a substantial amount of important research involving neonates, infants and children, as well as research involving adolescents and adults who lack the capacity for free and informed choice. Consider those with research on dementias or other serious cognitive impairments, or research involving comatose patients in ER settings. And informed consent is not operable in those kinds of things. In other words, there are important areas of research where human participants, like animals, enter research as passive rather than active participants. This raises a fundamental question in research ethics. In the pursuit of socially beneficial research, how can we make provision for the reliable protection of the interests of those who are unable to protect their own interests? There is another material connection between animal and human research. In medical research, the process typically begins in vitro, test tubes or whatever else, okay, and then proceeds to the in vivo stage. The first in vivo stage in current use involves animals. Only if sufficient promise is shown at the animal research stage does in vivo research proceed to humans. That is, in human research ethics, there is a strong commitment to the view that research in humans should not commence before promising and safe results have been shown at the animal stage. And I'm well aware that, of course, there's much slippage between animals and humans, just as there's much slippage between the in vitro stage and the in vivo stages. It was not always thus. 100 years ago or so, due to the anti-vivisection movement, in vitro research went directly to the human stage. Any research involving animals would then have serious material effects on research involving humans. In sum, we have rival views about whether humans or animals or humans should be first in line for in vivo research. Unless then we are willing to abandon in vivo research, we are faced with a choice of where to begin that research. The debate about whether or not research involving animals is morally acceptable can be cast in terms of whether and to what extent animals have moral status or considerability. It is worth noting similar debates about moral considerability in the human sphere that affect research practices. Given deeply held rival views about the moral status of human embryos, there are divergent positions on the acceptability of embryonic stem cell research. And if one recalls what the first actions, major actions of George W. Bush when he became president, were not to start a war in Iraq. They were to restrict the use of stem cell lines, embryonic stem cell lines, for researchers of federally funded projects in the United States. And that represents a very deeply held views about the status of embryos and about what's acceptable to do here. In countries like what happened in countries like the UK and Korea, there were no such restrictions. In Canada, we took a kind of a mixed position. The lesson to be drawn is that debates about moral considerability present deeply felt and extraordinarily hard to resolve sources of ethical division, and these affect both human and animal research. I turn now to specific governance issues in animal and human research. In the mid-1990s, I was involved in the establishment of the first standards used by the 3 federal research councils for regulating research involving humans. The creation and implementation of those standards was extraordinarily contentious. Because I was curious about the forces at work, and I'm an academic, I said, this is something one can do research on. So I began a sustained study that's lasted to this day on Canadian governance of ethical research involving humans. My research work on this topic has been going on for 15 years. Drawing on that research and on my practical involvement in both animal and human research ethics, I'd make the following points. First, in both domains, there are multiple interest groups from the public, private, and not-for-profit sectors, including research institutions, research sponsors, researchers, client institutions, advocacy groups, and diverse publics. The stakes in both areas can be quite high in terms of processes and results that affect human, animal, and environmental well-being and functioning, as well as economic and political implications. Second point, governance in both areas is messy in Canada in several respects. Only bits and pieces of each are found in legislation with significant variances amongst jurisdictions. In both human and animal research, federal research sponsors use their power to achieve some oversight of the area. Institutions receive funding conditional upon having all the research that's done at their institutions that involves human or animals follow the federal guidelines. It's a conditional kind of thing. There are also international norm standards and in some instances binding conventions that affect the two areas. As well, there is a minor degree of involvement by professional bodies, largely physicians and veterinarians, but I think this has been too little exploited. Third, a great deal of what is normally determinative in these areas is quite informal and appears more as mores than as formally stated standards. These present themselves as the practices and habits of investigators and their research teams, research institutions, sponsors, and regulators. What matters then is their ethos or moral culture. On the ground, how things are done around here carries more weight than officially endorsed norms. These cultures are subject to change over time, and in some cases we've seen very good changes over time. Fourth, governance in both areas includes quite limited, very limited participation by the public. There are some organized groups, such as the SPCA and health charities, that advocate for interests of their primary stakeholders. In some cases, representatives of such organizations are asked to participate in public or even private sector oversight activities. They may sit on, for example, become a member of the board of one of the research granting agencies. At the local level, there is formal involvement of community members, lay representation on research ethics boards and animal care committees. On rare occasions, there is outreach by research institutions or sponsors for greater public involvement in ethics governance. A few years ago, for example, Health Canada sought representative citizen input into the desirability of allowing xenotransplantation research. This would involve the breeding of genetically modified animals, in this case swine, to produce organs for transplantation, experimental transplantation into humans. The citizen panels were, in my view, rightly skeptical about these types of research. They posed very serious risks of the spread of zoonotic disease, which would have endangered both swine and human populations as well as other animal populations. I now want to talk about governance in the two areas in somewhat different terms. I see governance as the attempt in these areas in a society or organization to translate ethical views into ethical practice. For this purpose, I'm going to ask you to take at face value the stated ethical views embodied in the CCAC guidelines for research involving animals and Tri-Council guidelines for research involving humans. Just take those as a given for the moment. You may be skeptical about them, but that's okay. We're doing this as a thought experiment, okay? It is important to realize that it is not a given that the stated ethical views of organizations or societies will necessarily be reflected in practice. There can be hypocrisy, inconsistency, and discontinuities in the translation of stated norms into practice. There are pressure groups within society or organizations that may be actively or passively resistant to stated aims. There can also be disagreement about what generally stated norms mean in practice. Researchers notoriously complain about how uneven the judgments are of animal care committees and research ethics boards, not only across institutions, but within given institutions over time. With governance, what we want is appropriate accountability. We also want our governance structures to accomplish their stated ends. That is, we want more than compliance with stated rules. We also want the achievement of specific results, namely the humane treatment of research animals and respect for the dignity of human research participants. In other words, we want processes that allow relevant stakeholders to know whether or not the stated ends are being achieved, and where there is a failure to achieve desired ends, the opportunity to initiate requisite changes. In a democratic society, we rightly expect that a high degree of transparency and accountability, especially for public institutions, but not just public institutions, but especially for them. It was in this spirit of translating ethical goals into institutional practice that Dr. Kathy Shipley, a graduate of the Animal Welfare Program and formerly my postdoc, and I wrote an article comparing Canadian governance regimes for ethical research involving humans and ethical research involving animals. On 5 major dimensions, we found that research involving animals was significantly better governed in Canada than research involving humans. The 5 dimensions that we chose were first, compliance and universality, second, independence, third, accountability and quality assurance, fourth, transparency, and fifth, education. And I'm happy to go into detail about why the superior on the animal research side and over the human side. That is not to say that governance for research involving animals has no need of improvement. Drawing on international experience, Elisabeth Ormandy has already offered several suggestions in this regard. But it is sobering to think that despite broadly accepted values, that we have in Canada done such a poor job in regard to research involving humans. I will close by offering a few suggestions for improving the governance of both areas. First, we need greater transparency at institutional, provincial, and national levels. Moves by UBC to greater clarity around the use of animals in research are welcome in this regard. UBC would do well to publicize other elements of governance here in regard to education and quality assurance, as well as other relevant aspects of both human and animal research protection. And we've publicly said in several articles over the years published in law journals that institutions could do a much better job of local accountability. I mean, I think it's just really sad that our public institutions do not account locally for what we do in these areas. And I think we do some good things, but we don't account for them. Second, we need greater public participation. While community members sit on animal care committees and research ethics boards, they are not generally well supported. They are there in small numbers and without sufficient diversity. As well, they operate under strict rules of confidentiality so that they cannot really be bridges to their communities. The general problem here is that ethical review boards are insufficiently insulated from the research promoting arms of their institutions. Thus, reporting, and I've argued this in national policy debates as well as at this institution, having these committees report to the Vice President Research may be administratively convenient, but compromises independence. And I think there are ways of correcting it, and I've been involved in institutions which have found intelligent ways of dealing with this by arm's lengthening those parts of the organization from them. I believe that there is a need for diverse and extensive public participation at the national level for both research involving humans and research involving humans. While the Canadian Federation of Humane Societies has played a very important role in the CCAC, a more diverse representation is needed. On the human side, there is no formal engagement of any participant-based public involvement at the national level, and no involvement by any body, any arm's-length mediating body like the CCAC. So far, this series and our talks have centered on the public sphere, publicly funded research institutions. But we need to remember how much research takes place outside those settings. And it would be a mistake to simply say, well, it's public institutions that should be covered by these things. There are other areas that do research involving humans and research involving animals that is not covered. We should remember that when animals or humans are used in research, it is a privilege, not a right. The privilege is conditional on two things. First, doing good research, and second, doing good in research by treating research participants with appropriate ethical regard. In these remarks, I've tried to raise issues about governance of research involving animals from the perspective of human research ethics. I've pointed out parallels and connections as well as important differences. Finally, I would make this point. If you are concerned about research involving animals in this country at this university, then you ought also to express your concerns about research involving humans. Thank you for your attention.
So we've heard from our three distinguished panelists, and again, thank you for your time. And I know behind each of those 15-minute talks, there was lots and lots of hours of preparation. So what I would like to do now is open the floor to questions, and with the hope that we can have an academic, scholarly discussion on obviously a topic that is dear to all of us here, since you've all taken the effort to come out this evening. So can I open the floor? Okay, first, second.
Thank you very much. I'm the head of classical medicine and religious studies, so I don't have any investment in this academically, but I am a passionate animal advocate. I've actually got two questions, and you'll have to tell me if it's allowed to ask them. So first of all, of Michael, I'm really intrigued by your association of your commendation that we should be as concerned about human treatment as animal treatment and linking the two. And this Anne Cameron, I've got a bumper sticker on my car that says, people who abuse animals rarely stop there. That was our first conversation. And actually I care more about the abuse of animals than I care about the abuse of people. But it's a great bumper sticker because it does link the two, and there's lots and lots of grounds for linking the two. And so my question to Michael would be, do you think it is, do you commend that because it is politically efficacious to link the two so that people who might might be reluctant to take action regarding animals once they see there's a linkage with how we treat humans, once they make that connection, it's easier for them to work in both.
I'm smiling because actually why has there been more attention, if you like? Why do we have these things like CCAC? There's no equivalent body in Canada, so let's just take that as a thing. Why is there a body like that and there isn't on the human side? It's because people advocated on behalf of animals where people have not advocated on behalf of humans. And you would say, well, nothing bad happens to humans. I was talking to a woman the other day whose husband died because of a mistake in a phase 1 trial, okay? Now, he participated in the phase 1 cancer trial. That's the first in humans kind of thing. That's where it's toxicity study. They have unfortunately made a mistake and gave the wrong dosage of the medication and the person died. That's a very sad kind of thing. But, I mean, while she's tried to advocate on behalf of this, she's a voice crying in the wilderness. There are more voices crying out for animals, and that may sound strange to many of the people here, than there are for crying out for humans involved in research. So I'm saying it from that point of view rather than from the point of view of linking it the other way around.
Okay, I'll get back to you. Sure.
I'm Brian Vincent, Director at Stop BBC Animal Research. And as some of you may have seen in today's Vancouver Sun, the primate experiments at UBC are being investigated by the BC SPCA after a complaint we filed. And our investigative researcher found that 4 rhesus macaque monkeys had died because they'd been so severely disabled in brain research. And there are 14 other monkeys. We don't know the fate of those monkeys who were part of that experimentation. So my question is, how is it legal for a researcher at UBC to so severely disable these poor animals through injecting neurotoxins into their brain or giving them electroconvulsive shock to induce seizure, as well as other experiments like blinding monkeys, inducing glaucoma, for example? How is that legal? And because of the system that Elisabeth talked about, our citizens group has found it extremely difficult to get any information from UBC about these experiments, and we have no legal basis where we can file a lawsuit against UBC to stop these horrifically cruel experiments.
Were you posing that to someone in particular?
Anyone. we could use advice.
Amber, do you want to take?
Well, I'll just say that I agree with you that the way that our law is set up is not very helpful to deal with that type of situation. When you look at federal legislation, it really protects what are considered legal uses of animals, and of course, animal research is one of those legal activities that we allow. And provincially as well, it's the same thing. There's a specific defense set up in the provincial legislation around animal cruelty, which I know that, I was actually surprised to learn that the SPCA is investigating it because it's very difficult. So I actually commend them for giving that a go based on the information that you provided them. But the legislation has a defense built into it that if the activity is viewed as lawful and it's meeting the standard, the industry standard, then it can be, outside of legal purview. So, and I think the thing that's particularly troubling about that is if everyone in the industry is creating a lot of suffering for animals, then that's the industry standard. So the fact that more people do it actually makes it more okay, potentially under the law. So I agree with you. I think that's very problematic.
David?
The phrasing in the provincial law is that you are not allowed to cause distress to animals. And the exemption is for activities that are done in accordance with reasonable and generally accepted practices of animal management. The reasonable and generally accepted practice for laboratory animals is to have a humane endpoint decided beforehand, so that if suffering ensues, and there's certain criteria here, the animal should be humanely killed. So in this case, I obviously don't know the details, but the way it's been presented to us would not fit what I would look upon as reasonable and generally accepted practices of animal experimentation, and therefore I would see that as falling outside the law. So I think investigating should be very appropriate in this case. The question then becomes, is the case as presented to us today, is this actually what happened?
And I don't think we know the answer to that because the investigation is ongoing.
I have a question regarding the status of essentially animals used for reproductive labor. These seem to be animals that aren't test subjects and therefore don't get the benefit of whatever the benefits that test subjects would get, and yet they're still housed within a lab and they're still excluded from this. I just wonder how exactly they fit in legally or within the CCAC guidelines.
Sure. Just to clarify, they are covered under a CCAC program. There's no requirement to give breeding animal numbers to the CCAC as far as I understand it. I know that some institutions do have breeding animal numbers in there, and they do give them to CCAC. They're just not reported out at present to be put in the public domain. So those animals absolutely are protected.
Yeah, I think there's an ethics they have to go for ethics. A protocol is submitted to the ACC describing all of that. But I think the point, as Elisabeth said, is that the animal numbers are not, for those breeding colonies, are now not publicly posted at the end of the year.
Yeah, my question is more concerning the reproductive labor, right? I wonder what are the guidelines or what does that stand in regards to, what are the ethical considerations surrounding the guidelines as to what is too much pressure on reproduction or too little? What are the appropriate controls on that reproductive labor? Because that's where my concern, because that seems to be a very big gray area. I don't know at what point.
Can you just clarify and maybe what you mean by reproductive labor?
It seems to be animals used to breed other animals, correct?
Sure.
That's what being used. So that seems to be a controlled. I'm concerned. My question is, what is the regulations surrounding that control? For instance, we know within slaughterhouses, certain animals, there are certain devices, certain electrodes that require hens to breed more, for instance, right? More than their cycles would allow for, to shock them into these kind of cycles. So I'm concerned. My question is, what exactly are the guidance surrounding that?
So the CCAC has a general guide for the care and use of laboratory animals. And so within that would be, there's also guidelines on housing and housing requirements and things. They're all freely available online for you to go and look at. Go look at the ccac.ca and you have, there's public access to all the guidelines. Off the top of my head, I don't know whether there's an actual section in the Guide to the Care and Use of Lab Animals that specifically deals with breeding animals. There may well be, but it's freely available for you to go and look at. The guides, volumes 1 and 2, cover the general lab practice, and then there are specific guidelines, for example, on genetically engineered animals, farm animals, marine mammals, etc. So yeah, there isn't a separate one on breeding animals, though, to my knowledge. So they must be covered under the general guide.
Hi, I just had a comment on the first question and then the rhetorical question that was an answer is, I think the reason so many people are more concerned with the treatment of laboratory animals is that they're being harmed and killed intentionally, whereas arguably that doesn't happen with people.
I would agree with that, and I would just say that for the most part, people's consent is obtained for experiments, and when it's not, we definitely do take that seriously as a society, and I think we condemn that. So I think that, with respect, it's a bit of comparing apples and oranges, in my view.
Just a word of caution, though, like Michael alluded to, there being some actual grey areas around the free and informed consent that humans give if they're vulnerable or under coercion, for example. But absolutely, I would agree with you too, that for me, I do see an ethical difference with the use of animals in research because of that intent to cause harm. You're intending to create a disease model. And so I think that, just my personal opinion, is that we have somehow greater obligations to those animals.
Why do scientists think that they have to model one of these diseases in a rat or a mouse or some other animal, all of which are different? So you get different results from each experiment. And it's unreliable. Which one are you going to choose? Jane Goodall recently came out, recently challenged the widely held belief that animal tests are necessary for the advancement of scientific medicine, and she called it a betrayal of the scientific method. Could you please comment on what that might mean? The scientific method and how it could betray experimentation on animals. What is the scientific method that compels or that compels people to think that they have to model a disease, a human disease in another animal? If you were studying rats, you would study mice instead.
So
doesn't make any sense to me.
So I'll attempt to answer your question.
Michael said, Mike.
Oh, you wanted
Let me try. Were you here at the last session?
No.
At the last session, we had 3 scientists, 2 of whom are still actively engaged in research. All of them have used animals in their research. And they explained that they didn't have alternatives that were available that would provide better models for doing what they were doing. Now, I know I've worked with at least one of the researchers, is one of Canada's leading stem cell researchers. If these people do not see other ways of doing this, then I take them at their just a second. If I could just finish.
Right.
Pardon? But if I could just finish. If they don't see an alternative, then maybe they're missing something, but I don't think it would be for want of trying to understand. I mean, if there were easier alternatives in terms of being able to come up with computer models or other kinds of things, surely people in the various areas would be doing this kind of thing. Otherwise, do we believe there's a vast conspiracy of scientists not to do things in the most efficient and the most efficacious kind of way? I mean, it just doesn't. I'll be honest. It strains my credulity to believe that these people are somehow missing something here. Now, maybe with advances of various kinds, there will be better models, and we do hope that there will be replacement kinds of things for using either humans or animals.
Why do the rates of disease keep rising? We're not getting healthier.
Yeah, I strongly encourage you to listen to the last lecture, because it's all posted on YouTube, and that was actively discussed by people in the audience at that meeting, and it's all available on YouTube. The other thing, just to echo what Michael said, what all the researchers did say is that in a perfect world, they wouldn't use animals. So, but I really, really encourage you to go onto YouTube and listen to that.
I have another comment.
No, one sec. You had another question?
I do, but I'm very sympathetic to the question that's being asked right now, and my answer would be, if you can answer the question and pursue the research project without experimenting on animals, then you've just got to wait until some other technology comes along. There's lots of other fields where you can make analogs. There's certain things you couldn't do before. You could send particles down a tunnel. And now, as technology changes, you can do certain experiments. So I think the humane and ethical thing to do would be just to wait until the technology is there and not to experiment on animals. I presume it's just because it's already been done that it occurs to people that they can do it, and we need to get back to a place where, if we were designing scientific experiments from the ground up, would it actually occur to us to do experiments about humans on rats? I think the point that was made about you wouldn't experiment to investigate rats by looking at mice is a really good one.
Can you get to your question? Thanks.
The question is for Elisabeth. I was really fascinated by some of the language that you used, that you reported in the different countries' methods of analysing the severity of experiments. So I wrote down here that you reported that the UK has 3 categories: mild, moderate, and substantial. Yeah. And I just wanted, as a linguist, to comment on that substantial isn't the opposite of mild, that a word like severe might be. So as a Latin professor, my business in the world these days is to point out that Latinate language is often used to obscure the reality of things, especially when that reality is damaging certain members of the population. I wanted to hear a little bit more about the New Zealand categories. You just mentioned fleetingly that New Zealand doesn't use categories of severity, but you said something about it uses domains. And just wondered if you could unpack that and explain it for us a bit.
Absolutely,
Thank
sure.
you.
So just to say that the UK categories actually, I used it's coupled with suffering, I think. So there's mild suffering, moderate suffering, and substantial suffering, I believe. So that's the UK categories. In New Zealand, in New Zealand, part of their harm classification system uses domains of welfare compromise. In farm animal research, instead of using the 3 R's, which I alluded to in my talk, in farm animal welfare, we talk about the 5 freedoms. And so I think what's happened is that they've used the 5 freedoms framework and applied it to a laboratory animal welfare. And so the domains of welfare compromise, for example, will talk about whether there's been a compromise in the animal's ability to access water or food, a welfare compromise in terms of its pain state. So it's more animal focused. So those are the domains of welfare compromise. And I believe that though that system is also publicly available online, there's an organisation called ANSCART where, and I also, not to promote my own work, but there's a paper that I actually reviewed with Nicole Fenwick and Julie Griffin, my co-authors from CCAC, that describes international systems for categorizing harms to animals in research, and I can give you the citation if you like. Yeah.
I'm just curious about the foundational rationale for the kind of classification of types of life. We seem to have a conception of human life and then animal life. I was wondering if these kind of discussions are naturally limited to or can also be expanded potentially to areas of, let's say, plant or even bacterial life. And is that something that's desirable, or how do we kind of, I mean, is the only reason why we're including animal life because we empathize with it, or are these concerns applicable to all different kinds of life?
So why are we concerned, say, put a higher priority on human and animal life as opposed to, say, bacterial life? Well, I think probably go back to what Laura was talking about at the very beginning, is because we're concerned about the capacity for having feeling states, for being aware. And if we thought that bacterial life was aware, then that would surely change our conception or our view of other kinds of life. Or if we thought that plant life was aware, then, and had feeling states, emotive states and things like that, then of course our view would change on those things. I mean, then we would enter the area where, to use language that's often used here, we'd feel there was a moral considerability. There was something here valuable that we should be concerned about.
I'll just add a little bit to that. I completely concur with what Michael has said, but I will add that in Bruno Latour's understanding of bringing the collective together, it seems to me that it's not only animals and humans, or animals and human animals, that can be considered in the collective, but also entities like a stream, for example, an ecosystem. So they could be represented by scientists, by activists, by elected politicians and so forth, and there would be public debate about the state of that entity as an entity that's part of the community.
Can I just add to that? Yeah. I just want to say, I think that the focus is, I think it derives somewhat from, I mean, there's lots of people that I think have raised this point, but Jeremy Bentham comes to mind, a philosopher from, I forget when, 1800s, who raised the point at the time when working animals were really at the forefront in society and very visible, that, the thing that we need to be concerned about is beings that suffer, beings that have the capacity, have sentience and the ability to suffer, and whether they have what we in our wisdom call, rationality or intelligence is actually even besides the point. It's really around, can they suffer? And I think that's why there's the focus. And I think maybe we'll get to a point where we care about bacteria, but for me personally, I care about the fact there's a lot of suffering going on right now, and that to me is a focus.
And then the individual behind you. You're first.
As someone who does animal justice advocacy, I'm always troubled when I come here. I come here full of hope, and I go home so disappointed because the language that I hear by the panelists, most panelists, is the language of reform, regulate, there's more we can do. I never hear, let's end it. Let's end the oppression of other animals. Why do I not hear that? Why do we collectively, obviously I haven't polled anybody here, but why do we just accept because it's happening that it has to continue? And if we continue using that kind of language, it will continue. It may get better, it may not get better, but my goodness, we wouldn't be speaking like this if we were talking about enslaved prostitutes, if we were talking about child soldiers, if we were talking about other humans who are oppressed, and yet other animals, somehow, we categorize them differently. Even those of us who are activists, somehow we accept that because it's being done, there's not much more we can do. We need to change the paradigm. Those of us who really care need to change that paradigm and need to just end it and ask for ending it. Ask for, stop it. Stop the oppression of other animals.
Well,
It's more a comment than a question, but...
Well, big return comment then. I think it's because we're not one here, because there's a variety of views in this room, and a variety of views in this institution and in society in general. We're not of one mind on this. And there are very, very deep divides around these issues. There are other areas where there are extraordinarily deep divides, and they're very hard to resolve. I talked about one of them, the status of the human embryo. That has become such a deep divide that in some cases there have been societies are polarized around those issues. And think of the United States and debates around abortion and things like that. I mean, people are passionate on both sides on those kinds of things. And a society is divided. And one of the advantages of coming together as a collective is to discuss the deep divides and to see what we can do about it. So some of us will talk in a more reform-minded way because we're on one side of the divide and not on the other side. Doesn't mean we're all of one particular color, but we may not agree about some of the other things that you feel very passionately. But we come together to have a dialogue. We're not of one mind. And I think that has to be remembered, that's the occasion that we're here, and that we do have these honest, deeply felt differences of view. And that's an advantage of coming together, is to discuss those things and to offer, if you like, why we think our views are right, and to listen, I hope, with open ears to each other and try to understand where the other people are coming from.
So I'm a Master's of Public Policy student, so I come to animal welfare from a policy point of view. And so I'm curious, you all offered prescriptions of what could be next, what should be, what can we do? The next statement is how, like where, like we can all say what should be done, what can be done, but activism can take to a certain degree, citizen activism, citizen deliberation, but what actually can make legislative bodies take the next step? And so that's, I guess, a question for everyone to think about, but also if you want to take a stab at it.
Elisabeth, do you want to talk a little bit about what you propose to do for your postdoc?
So I'm going to try and do exactly what you were talking about. Okay, so I've thought about this question, we've thought about where we can go next. And a lot of what I want to do is to try and actually encourage more public engagement and more democratic processes. First of all, starting at an obviously academic research level, but because of my link with CCAC, hopefully we'll actually get some of that stuff going through the policymaker channels too. So there's one, it's not the one that I've been funded for yet, but I put in an application with an expert on UBC campus, an expert in deliberative democracy, to actually have a 4-year research program where we host deliberative democracy events. And the point of those is not to go in with an agenda at all. The point is to go and to let views surface. Sure, there will be areas of agreement and disagreement, but it isn't to focus on those things. It's more to say, what are our hopes, what are our concerns, and what decisions can we live with, ultimately. And so, that, to me, that's the keystone of democracy, is that you kind of, I won't be driving the outcomes, neither will the policymakers who are invited partners on that. And just to say that the BCS-BCA are also our invited partners, so we try to really, get wheels in motion. It's not funded yet, but I am hopeful. But even if it isn't, there's like Laura and Nina and myself and a couple of other individuals around the room that are very committed to the process of trying to really think about how we can affect change, not just talk about what should and shouldn't happen.
I can just provide a comment on that. The CCAC has signed on as an active collaborator on that project, because these are questions that the CCAC desperately is looking for answers to. But again, this is probably the first attempt, so hopefully, Elisabeth has got funding for her postdoc, and that looks after her salary. We've now looked at going, because these things don't come without a price tag. We've put in for an application to take it to this next level, to literally get sort of this discourse going, this public engagement.
I just want to clarify your question. Are you saying what can people do if they're concerned about animals? Like, is that what's the next step that way, or?
I want to motivate people to think about as a citizen, what can I do, but also as more than a citizen, what can I step up? What initiative can I take that? Because as a citizen at this point, the processes that are in place don't allow you any or very little motivation towards provincial laws or which are often what regulates. And so maybe think about how can we change our society so that those things are more manipulated and so that there's more provisional laws. So that, I guess, does that make sense?
It does make sense. For me, the thing that really struck me when I was in school and learning about some of this stuff is just the lack of visibility. Like, we talk about, let's open this up to debate and what's the public going to think? Well, when you put a picture of monkeys, right, for the public view, what's the public view? And I think that those things are deliberately hidden, and I appreciate the comments around transparency and accountability, because I think the more that those things, what's actually happening in reality is visible to people, the more that's an impetus for change. It changed me. I became a vegetarian after learning about what happens to animals, right? And I think, in fact, we're all culpable. We all are supporting industries that are making billions of dollars on the lives of animals. That's a fact. So, we have a choice. Every person in this room has a choice to not support that.
David had a comment?
Just as a small thing people can do, where are the avenues for policy change? Canada's Constitution is deemed to not allow the federal government to legislate in this area, but the provinces can. And so simply having each province cite suitable standards and as a start, let's take the CCAC standards and reference those in the cruelty to animals legislation. That would at least create a common acceptance of those standards and give them a degree of legal acceptance. A problem at the moment is some provinces have done so already, but with different wording. And so there needs to be a conversation among the provinces about how to do this in an effective and uniform way.
So, just to correct me if I'm wrong, British Columbia has just started to engage in the discussions of whether or not the CCAC standards should be cited. Whereas other provinces, Newfoundland is also in discussions, they're further along. Alberta already cites them, Manitoba I think also cites them. So it's a little bit of a hodgepodge right now, but I mean that's our legal system.
I have a question, a two-part question for Elisabeth. I think you'd be the person to ask. Looking at the ACC guidelines, I see pilot projects are encouraged. Pilot projects not necessarily receive full ACC review and approval. And also my second part, and then I let you go ahead and tell me what you think. I don't see any stipulation in the ACC guidelines that alternatives have to be actively sought. University of Guelph, I see they have a website where you must search for the alternatives and argue why you can't use those alternatives. So, just querying if you have any knowledge of this.
I don't have any knowledge of that. I can't speak on behalf of the university's ACC. I don't sit on it. And I know as much as you in terms of their processes. My understanding is that pilot studies must undergo ethical review.
Not necessarily full ethical review.
Can I answer that? They undergo the same review as a full research protocol. The reason they're encouraged is if somebody's doing something new that's never been done before, you don't know the full impact, they're actually encouraging the researcher, instead of getting a full approval for a few years using lots of animals, they get approved for a small number of animals for only 3 months. And after that, they have to report back. So that's reviewed and approved, it has to be. After that, if they want to continue with more animals in the full protocol, they need to provide a progress report, say how it went and all that happened. So it's not true that it doesn't go the same review as it does.
The ACC guidelines from the ACC website.
I'm on the committee, I can vouch for you.
There is that paragraph that says, full ACC approval will not be required.
It is, I'll look at it again, but it is. If I can tell you that for sure. It's the same research approval protocol, you just said pilot versus full. And it just means it's for a shorter length of time.
And Joanna, can you also comment on the 3 hours aspect of, the replacement, the same stipulations are required?
So it's the same as well for both research protocols and pilots, because it's the same protocol that you have to fill out. There is a section, what alternatives have you considered and are there any, and why can't you not use them? So that is part of it.
And is there a review of those protocols? Like if a researcher says, well, I looked at such and such, but that won't work for me, does somebody actually go into that and check and say, well, why?
In an ideal world, they would, honestly. It depends how much time there is, but there is something that they're required to look at that and tell us what they've looked at and why they can't use it.
Yeah, so one thing we haven't really talked about as much is the animal care committees themselves, like how do they actually function? And from just some papers I've read, there appears to be some problems with like composition and the workflow. And I was wondering if they, by improving how the animal care committees review research protocols, that could somehow help to either improve the lives of animals or reduce their usage. Because the way I see it is essentially the animal care committees, they're like the courtrooms for the animals. Like, this is where their fate is really determined. So I was wondering if you could speak on some details about how they function exactly and what aspects could be improved.
And you've sat on them.
Yeah, and also Kathy Shipley also wrote a lot about, in her dissertation, wrote about from sitting on and interviewing lots of people on animal care committees. I think it's a very valuable area. There are some studies out there, just as there are a few studies out there, not as many as there should be, of how, say, research ethics birds work on the human side. And that's one of the reasons I said, the proclaimed reality is often different than the reality on the ground. And one of the advantages of doing this kind of research is you actually find out what goes on during the meetings and what are sometimes the barriers to these things. And you've alluded to a couple of them. One is overload. If you get this huge stack of protocols and you're asked to review tons and tons of them, it's really hard. So the meetings can be just the crowding of agendas can be a serious problem. Expertise is another one. Do you have enough expertise on the group? And particularly do the lay members feel like they're insiders or outsiders? So I mean, those are various kinds of factors that do affect it. Now, mind you, if you think the whole enterprise is mistaken, then you don't even want to go down the route of having animal care committees. You don't want research involving animals. But if you do want to go down and have some research involving animals, even if it was just of, let's say, what you would call passive studies or observational studies of animals and things like that, if you want something like that, you'd need something that had a group of people that actually looked at what was going on, proposed to go on in the research, but also a process that you'd want during the research. So, I mean, one of the advantages of the CCA process, CCAC mandated process, is that they have some audit of what's going on afterwards in research. They don't rely just on self-reports of the researcher. They actually will go in selected cases and take a look, at least in some of the more severe cases. So that helps, and it helps the functioning of the Animal Care Committee, because as you find out what actually went on in the research, you can now look back on what you did and say, oh, we made those decisions. We thought it was going to turn out this way, it really didn't turn out that way, or it did turn out that way. That's not done on the human side at all. We have very little in the way of audit, very little in the way of feedback to what goes on here. So there are things, and there are some good recommendations out there, probably not as complete as they need to be, that would improve functioning in these areas and would help people in this situation who sit on these kinds of committees. And I made some couple of suggestions about having a more inclusive kind of representation of people. I think there should be better community representation. I mean, I don't think there's enough community representation, and a diverse enough community representation. I mean, we ask people from the Humane Society to take on. It's a very difficult position to be on an animal care committee if you're in that kind of thing. And you need other members of the community, because the humane movement, frankly, doesn't represent all the people within society. There are diverse groups within society and diverse interests. And we need something from those various perspectives, to some extent, within these oversight bodies. To some extent, I say.
Just to provide an additional comment on that, is that there is a group of us, Bill Milson, David, Elisabeth, and I, who are trying to organize a workshop where we actually bring in experts from other jurisdictions. I think what many people don't realize is that the CCAC was started in 1968. It was the first country, I think, in the world to have an ethical oversight system. It's been 40 some odd years. Probably time that we take a look at how we do business. But one thing to recognize is that most of the other systems around the world use the CCAC as a platform to start from. They have taken it to the next level. It is now our turn, I think, to go look out there and take what they've learned and come back and revisit what we've been doing.
Who is the CCAC? It's all government agencies, isn't it?
Yeah.
For the Humane Society.
Yeah, so the CCAC is represent 22 organizations at 28 council members. Yeah, in 1968. So right now it is primarily animal-based researchers representing different aspects of animals used in science. I mean, we do have, like Michael worked for the university but was a member of the Canadian Bioethics. What we have been successful in the past year, like the only non-animal user by definition now was the Canadian Federation of Humane Societies, is a founding member of the CCAC since 1968. We've just increased them from 3 to 4. I know it's not lots, but they are now, no other organization holds as many seats. So that is one little step. It is something, though, that the CCAC is looking at, is trying to figure out how do we get broader representation of the public.
And the Humane Society's
yeah. Oh, sorry.
The Humane Society's position is that Health Canada says that animal research is necessary.
Yeah.
That's the only rationale they give. And yet that's supposed to be the...
Yeah, I can't speak for what the Canadian Federation of Humane Societies...
Thousands of doctors have said that animal experiments cannot be extrapolated to others, to human beings. Therefore, abolition is the only choice we have. And that would get rid of all this anguish that we're in tonight.
Yeah. But I think
no more suffering if we just listen to those doctors who have said animal experiments are useless. In fact, they're counterproductive because they produce disease. They make, it leads to error.
Okay, thank you. Abby?
Yes, my field is animal behavior. I'm a biologist. And somebody asked, where do we go from here? What can we do? And my overwhelming feeling is that public education is where it's at. But I'm thinking specifically about the research that's been done in my field on animal cognition. And there's been a lot of heat, a lot of smoke, and not a whole lot of light, I think, in a lot of this debate. I don't mean tonight's debate. I mean in the general debate about do animals have rights? What is an animal versus a human? And how much should we, how much freedom or leeway should we give them? And I think that something that could be added, should be added, is increased public education, increased transparency of experiments on animal cognition, so that more people understand them. And I think my biggest beef is with the education system pre-university and developing the mindset that humans are really different from other animals. Well, I mean, for that matter, chimpanzees are different from fish. So you really, I mean, I'm making a very broad. So this leads to a question.
Okay.
I promise. I feel, and this is really addressed to Amber, I guess, and that's the law in so many cases seems to lag behind the reality of what animals can experience, what they can do. Mm-hmm. And I feel that the law is driven by public perception, public pressure. And I wanted to know where you see, or where anybody would see, change in the law actually happening, or where it could start. Because if it doesn't, I mean, as long as mice, rats, birds, fish, reptiles are excluded.
That's only the US.
That's the US, not
That's
Canada.
not Canada.
Oh, okay, but either way, I'll still stand by what I say. Could you comment more on the law and public perception lagging behind reality?
Yeah, I think that it's really difficult right now with our particular political climate. I don't think that conservatives are generally known as people really advocating for animal rights per se. I will say that the penalties have been increased under the conservative government for animal cruelty federally, but again, the language in it is still the same. Animals are still in the property section of the criminal code. All lawful activity is completely excluded. You have a really high burden to prove cruelty, even in those very small cases. So I think, unfortunately, right now it's pretty difficult. But the thing that I'm hopeful about is we live in an era where you can really provide information quickly and widely to a lot of people. And, tweeting. I've just discovered Twitter. I've joined however long it's been going on, 10 years, I finally decided to get with the Twitter program. And I'm adding things that are of interest to me. So, I've just added Stop UBC Animal Research onto my Twitter. And I'm getting information, right? I'm getting information about whatever I think is important, right? So I think it's that visibility, as you say, the education, right? The information being out there, whatever that information is, let's talk about what's actually going on and let's go from there.
Okay, you had your hand up.
I'm wondering about specifically the university's role in this debate, because we think of the university as a place where ideas are exchanged and it's an open area for learning. And this ties into the deliberative comments you're making. If there is a concern that animals are being taken advantage of, being oppressed in a university setting, shouldn't those concerns be made more prominent? And maybe animal research should be stopped on the university while this debate is had until we come to a consensus on how to move forward. Do you guys see a contradiction there between the university's role in testing and in fostering open learning?
I think the university could be a good deal more open, and I've certainly advocated that
that we could be much more open about what we do at a local kind of level and stuff. I mean, and pressure has at least increased, led to a little bit more openness, not probably as much as needs to be, and certainly not enough probably to satisfy many of the people in this room. I think the openness would be helpful. We're a publicly funded institution. A lot of the funds that we do receive for research are public funds too, so there's a second reason why we want to be open about it. And we ought to be perfectly honest, we're very proud of the research we do, and we publicize the research, and we should be giving thanks to those who make those research possible. And so that means being open about, if we're using animals in research, then we ought to say how we use animals in research. So I think a good deal more openness is a possibility here. Now, there are all kinds of complicating interests as to why we're not. There are fears around these kinds of things. I mean, very serious kinds of fears that sometimes exhibit. And there have been places where working in the area of animal research has led to very serious risks to those who do those kinds of things. So there are those kinds of fears. There are fears about intellectual property, etc. I think some of those need to be discussed and dealt with in an appropriate kind of way, but more transparency would certainly help here. Can you bring anything to a halt in midstream? Pretty hard. I mean, I would just say institutions like universities and lots of other things have a lot of momentum, and the idea that we would somehow stop and arrive at a consensus or at least a strong majority view about where to head on these things, I think that's unlikely to take place. But there certainly can be, governance has to take place as things are functioning along. And I think it can pressure a lot for, as I say, more transparency, more research on these areas. I think things around research that involves animals and their cognitive and emotional states, those are really valuable kinds of things. The work that I see being done, and I get to sample it from time to time and examine it from time to time, in the animal welfare program, those are all really valuable kinds of things because they increase our understanding of what it is we're dealing with. It's no longer as mysterious, and it opens up really important kinds of questions for us, questions that we wouldn't have posed before. And hopefully we will reflect that eventually in the practices that we have in the institution. And I think putting pressure on for the institution to do those kinds of things is all beneficial. It's to good effect.
So on that wise note, I'm going to, did you want to make one more comment?
I was just going to actually add to what Michael was saying, that it seems to me in the discussion at UBC that often we conflate transparency with critical deliberation, and they're not actually the same thing. So as Michael just ended saying, we should ask our university, or we ourselves as the university should create forums and venues to bring us all together for critical deliberation as the university becomes more transparent.
So on that note, I want to thank the panelists again for taking the time to come tonight. I also want to remind the audience again of the Dr. DeWall's lecture tomorrow at 3 in the Frederick Wood Theatre, which I know will be very, very inspirational, and it'll be, I encourage you all to take the time to come to that. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to be your moderator this evening, and please continue to ask questions. Thanks.